Our hand could do a small amount of 3-betting for sure. And it's pretty tough though, and inflating the pot with an offsuit combination of broadways feels a little bit worse, so we're just gonna call.
Check.
Okay, he's checking range. It's a board that has a decent amount of draws. You might even defend like a little bit too wide. It's either like a bigger, better check spot. He's pretty covered on queens. With a club, I'd be like a lot happier to bet. I'll just check back and like have some board coverage on like overcards to where I'm not just like underprotected.
So being at a nut disadvantage and out of position, Berkey's check is standard. But Landon's hand could probably go either way with a check or bet. Landon articulates that he's viewing this as a big bet or check spot, particularly because of the significant number of draws that are likely in the big blind's range. And it is true that the more draws that are present, the less inclined the pre-flop progressor should be to bet range, and sizings will often be larger. However, although the solver does use the larger sizing with significant frequency, presumably to attack those sorts of decent equity hands in the big blind's range, it uses the small sizing more often. Although Berkey does have a decent percentage of middling hands and draws, he also has a decent percentage of trash, particularly Jack, King, and Ace Rag, which will likely autofold to any bet. And you'll often find that a range's bluffs and protection bets actually drive bet sizing even more so than a range's value combos in many scenarios, particularly on earlier streets where protection is important and weaker and mediocre hands tend to be more prevalent. Value bets win chips regardless of the size of the bet, and win more chips the bigger the bet is. However, the same is not true for folds, which win the same amount of chips regardless of the bet, but lose chips in direct proportion to the size of the bet when the bluff fails. This means that although the probability of getting folds also increases with bet size, weak and mediocre hands tend to be incentivized to make the smallest effective bet possible, especially on earlier streets where ranges will often overfold significantly compared to MDF. So from an EV perspective, when a range has an opportunity to generate many folds with a small efficient bet, you'll frequently see a small size used throughout the range, including with value combos that can benefit from expanding villain's calling range. To underscore this point, what happens if we alter Berkey's range to carve out his trash hands? Well, despite the fact that Landon's range is the exact same, the board is the exact same, the tree is the exact same, and Berkey's strong and medium hands and draws have been kept the exact same, the solver shifts to a more polarized strategy with fewer small bets and more checking. And if we go the other way, by keeping all of the original parameters the same, but remove many flush draws, we see that the cutoff checks less often and bets more often with the small sizing, because this bet will be more effective against a range with a higher proportion of autofolds. And this highlights why analyzing single ranges in isolation only tells you half the story, and why we have always focused on juxtaposing both players' ranges side by side. Trying to understand GTO strategies by only observing the range of the player to act, without also referencing the opponent's range as well, is akin to the sound of one hand clapping. In order to truly understand how EV is maximized, it's imperative to understand the connection between one player's strategy and the other player's relative equity distribution, because it is the latter that largely drives the former. Now, some have the view that a small flop c-bet is indicative of a range bet, and while that is sometimes true, it is not always the case. Here, the big blind has enough connections to this board to warrant some amount of checking, so we will move on to the Meso analysis. Landon's holding is likely in the non-realizing class that is usually not going to win if the hand is checked to showdown. This means that he should have an incentive to bluff because the EV of his checking line will be low. But given that we are cutoff versus big blind in a single raise pot, his range is too wide to just c-bet all non-realizing hands on a board like this, so he needs to figure out a way to differentiate between the non-realizing hands he bluffs with versus those that he checks back. Generally speaking, in most flop and turn scenarios, we'll want to prioritize bluffing with our best front door draws, since even if villain calls, we will still have a decent shot of leaping ahead with a very strong hand. And Landon has a decent proportion of combo draws, flush draws, and straight draws to choose from. He also has a number of hands with backdoor qualities as well, and as Landon mentioned, he would have been more inclined to c-bet with a club.
Obviously quite relieved to see a check back, as we were going to have a very close decision if we faced a small bet, given that we don't have a club in our hand. King Jack with the King of Clubs would be a pretty natural check raise. Without it though, I think it would have been a very thin check call. On the turn 9, we can't check call our hand, it's too weak, but we do need to see a river. I don't really think we get the big bet with these types of candidates, as we have 0 blocking power over 7-8, and we also block Landon's call folds in Jack 10, which isn't really great, King 10 as well. So in situations like this, where it's clear that we are going to have to see a river and would like to set our own price, oftentimes we're just going to lead on a slightly smaller bet sizing. Something in the neighborhood of 33 to 40% pot usually functions pretty well. We could put our strongest hand, like 7-8 of clubs, in this range, as well as sets. And we can fit hands like King 10, King Jack, Jack 10 in this range as well, as some one pair hands like Queen Jack, Queen 10. Our best hands like 7-8 no clubs, Queen 9, and if we ever have pocket 9s, would probably be fit into a much larger sizing, something in the neighborhood of pot to pot and a quarter. So with that said, $35 in the pot, we are going to be looking at, let's go 15.
Given Landon's check back on the flop, it likely capped his range to a certain extent, and this 9 does not uncap it. Since the big blind should have been checking range on the flop, it retains all of its 8-7 suited, combos, sets, 2 pairs, and top pairs, whereas the cutoff should have lost some or all of these hands with its passive play, as most of these combos should have generally wanted to start building a pot. So this turn card, along with the flop action, likely shifts the nut advantage to Matt, making his range more balanced. As for Landon's range, given that he's at a nut disadvantage, the next question is whether his range is mid or bottom heavy. In this case, it appears that it is more bottom heavy for 3 reasons. First, given that the cutoff was predominantly utilizing a smaller sizing on the flop, it means that his checking range will not be as mid-heavy compared to if the cutoff was utilizing predominantly a larger betting scheme. This is because larger bets tend to be more polarizing, whereas smaller bets will often incorporate plenty of middling hands, since the opponent should be calling wider. If we filter the cutoff's flop strategy for combos that bet the smaller sizing, as we increase the frequency threshold, we see that the range becomes more and more mid-heavy. Secondly, although the in-position player tends to be more polarized with his betting compared to the out-of-position player since he closes the action, generally speaking, the wider the in-position player's range is, the more likely it will be that his check-back range will include plenty of very weak hands. This is because, as we mentioned, wide ranges tend to have a lot of trash, which can't all be bluffed, especially when there are not a ton of value combos to support. And third, many of Landon's flop checkbacks were likely mid to low underpairs and ace-high combos, and equity for these types of hands has become even more diminished by this 9 turn, which brings in a straight, sets, 2 pairs, and a new second pair. In other words, this turn card applies downward equity pressure to much of Landon's range, both in terms of showdown value and outs, making it more bottom heavy. So given the combined effect of these considerations, from a theory perspective, relatively speaking, Landon's range should have a decent proportion of trash, which will struggle to continue. And as we discussed, when a player is at a nut disadvantage and he has plenty of trash, from a theory perspective, his opponent will often want to attack with a smaller sizing. As mentioned, Berkey should have retained his entire range from the flop by checking, including medium strength hands and trash that generally prefer smaller bets. But as the pre-flop caller in a single raise pot versus a late position open, this also means that his retained range contains many weak hands that can't all be bet, so we move on to the Meso analysis. Similar to Landon's decision on the flop, Matt's specific hand is likely also in the non-realizing class with limited showdown value against Landon's checkback range. But in this case, Matt does have the additional equity of the draw, giving him a greater incentive to bet compared to the same hands without a draw. Now, there are a few different ways that Matt could approach bluffing with his draws. He could just randomize across all draws based on the size of the bet and how much he thinks he should be betting overall, which would give him ample coverage on all runouts. Alternatively, he could prioritize bluffing with his strongest candidates, which appears to be his preference. He notes that he would prefer to bet with the larger sizings with his bluffs that contain a 7 or 8, which block the straight, and if we filter his unmade hands for combos that bet 3/4 pot or 150% of the pot at least 30% of the time, we see that these 7x and 8x combos are quite prevalent.
So he chooses a smaller size, like, it's not small, but it's like half pot. I think sizing wise should be a little bit bigger. Wants to like rep Queen X. Has some 9x maybe. My hand doesn't really want to raise very much because I'm getting a pretty good price to draw to an overcard. Jacks obviously like the nuts. But I don't think we cool any of his top end value when he chooses the size. It's just more likely to be like a one pair hand. So I think he's a bit weaker than he should be, but we still just have a call, but we'll sort of see what happens.
So Landon calls as he believes that his hand is more inclined to realize its equity against this small bet. He mentions that he would expect to see a larger bet from Berkey, which is consistent with the idea that Landon's c-betting strategy was more polarized compared to the solver, which in turn would render his check-back range more mid-heavy. However, here the solver does raise quite a bit, both with Landon's range and his hand. Given Berkey's relatively small bet, his range is likely balanced with some strong, medium, and weak hands. Facing that range, in theory, a significant portion of Landon's range should be incentivized to raise, either to deny equity from the middle and bottom parts of Matt's range, or to extract value given the high SPR and only one street to come.
Okay, so on almost all rivers, we were going to be betting somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% pot. We just have a really good bluffing candidate as we wrap around the queen, which is going to be the vast majority of Landon's bluff catchers, the rest being hands that contain an 8 or a 7. So he would be looking to bluff catch hands like 9-8, 9-7, 6-7. So his ace-6, ace-5, ace-9s wouldn't really perform all that well. So yeah, we were going to go like 3/4 pot. The 10 changes things a lot because now the nuts are king-jack, which we actually possess. So now Landon's bluff catchers are going to have to be a lot more jack heavy. So he'll want to be leaning on jack 10, queen jack, jack 9, and I suppose some hands that block the 8. So maybe like 10-8, no club, queen 8, no club if he has it. It's a little bit peculiar for us because our bluffs aren't really that intuitive any longer. Jack 8 made its hand. So did King Jack, which were two of our most prominent bluffs on the turn. We have some 2-pair combos in like Queen 9, Queen 10, but Queen 9 would have sized up on the turn, so that's pretty much ruled out. So we do have Queen 10 now, and perhaps like some low sets like 5s or 6s, but now they don't really get the opportunity to go big on the river. So basically we find ourselves in a situation where I think we would just want to like kind of scramble Landon's brain a little bit when he has a hand that versus a larger size would be a clear bluff catch. So if he has a hand like Jack 10, Jack 9 versus like 80 to 100% pot, those are probably going to be some of his better bluff catches, Queen Jack, etc. But if we choose something like 40% pot, I think perhaps we'll face some raises from hands like maybe Ace Jack of clubs if he has them. Potentially some 2-pair combos, though I think he's probably too disciplined for that. We could see some raising take place from more of his 8x range, as now it probably doesn't bluff catch quite as well since I could be getting thin with a 10. So with 65 in the pot, we're looking at a bet size of 25.
So Matt rivers the nuts, but decides to bet small again. Is this an example of street poker, or is it GTO? Well, we see that the solver actually prefers this bet with his hand and for most of the big blind's betting range. And there are 3 main factors that are likely driving this strategy from a macro perspective. One is Matt's small turn bet, which allows him to retain a good proportion of the middle part of his range on the river. If he had bet bigger, his range would become much more polarized, which generally prefers a larger bet. 2, Matt is out of position, which means regardless of how much he bets, or if he bets at all, Landon, as the in-position player, will still have the opportunity to bet or raise. Accordingly, all other things being equal, the out-of-position player's betting range tends to be much more merged, allowing for smaller bets with a wider variety of equity profiles compared to the in-position player whose betting range tends to be more polar. 3. Similar to the dynamic we saw on the turn, this 10 river does not change the nut advantage, but it does shift Landon's most likely hands down the equity distribution as it brings in additional straights, king jack and jack 8, two pairs, queen 10, 10 9, and 10 6, and second pairs, all hands which in theory can be in match range due to a small turn bet. In other words, although by calling the turn bet it strengthened the bottom part of Landon's range, this river crammed the middle part of his range, which was most prevalent, back down, making him bottom heavy once again. So the next question is, although Matt's hand is obviously strong enough to bet large, should it slow play with a small bet or even a check? Well, on the river, with protection no longer a factor, the decision of whether or not to slow play will come down to blockers. Specifically, if our hand is blocking a significant portion of villain's likely calling range to a large bet, the more inclined we should be to slow play. So in this situation, the most likely candidates in Landon's range that can call a large bet will be Queen X, Jack X, or 10X, and many of these combos are attached to a king. This means that holding a king and a jack significantly decreases the probability that Landon is holding a calling hand, thereby increasing the probability that Landon is holding a folding hand, which makes Matt's hand a good candidate to slow play. And we see that the lower straight, 8-7, is actually bet with much higher frequency, despite it being lower ranked, because this hand unblocks most of Landon's calling range to a large bet.
Just bets 25. Yeah, just have a bluff catcher. Probably gonna win. Raising's too thin, so I'm just gonna call and win.
You're fucking nuts?
Wow.
Given the small bet, Matt's range remains somewhat balanced with a decent percentage of mid-strength hands. So from a defending standpoint, Landon should be defending a good portion of his range, and the rank of his hand will be relevant. In this case, second pair is high up enough in the equity distribution to be a pure call, and we see that plenty of weaker hands can call as well.